Welcome to World Pulse Updates. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. On January 15, 2026, the Supreme Court delivered a unanimous 9-0 decision, an extraordinary moment in American legal history that captured the nation's attention. In this historic ruling, the court overturned Chevron deference, a legal doctrine that had shaped the way American government functioned for 4 decades, influencing countless court cases and agency decisions. For years, Chevron allowed federal agencies to interpret ambiguous laws as they saw fit, granting them broad authority over complex issues, ranging from environmental protection and workplace safety to financial regulations and healthcare policy. But the court's new ruling made it clear interpreting the law is the exclusive responsibility of the judiciary, not unelected bureaucrats. This decision reasserts the separation of powers that lies at the very heart of the U.S. Constitution, restoring a fundamental balance between the branches of government. What makes this moment even more remarkable is the rare unity it inspired. Justices from across the ideological spectrum, liberal and conservative alike, agreed that agency power had grown too unchecked and that it was time for the courts to reclaim their constitutional role. From now on, judges, not agencies, will have the final say in interpreting ambiguous laws. This shift will force Congress to draft legislation with greater clarity and precision, knowing that vague language will no longer be filled in by federal agencies. The effects of this decision will ripple through every aspect of American life, shifting power away from unelected officials and returning it to the courts and Congress, institutions directly accountable to the people. The story of how we reached this pivotal turning point begins with a group of fishermen, a decades-long legal battle, and a renewed national debate over the very nature of American government and who gets to decide what the law truly means. To truly grasp the significance of the Supreme Court's recent decision, we need to travel back to 1984, when the court established what became known as Chevron deference, in a landmark case involving the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. This doctrine instructed judges to defer to federal agencies' reasonable interpretations of ambiguous laws, effectively granting agencies broad authority to interpret and implement complex statutes. Supporters argued that agencies staffed with technical experts and scientists were best equipped to handle the intricate details of modern governance and rapidly evolving issues. But critics warned that this approach allowed unelected officials to make sweeping decisions that could affect millions, often with little direct oversight from Congress or the courts. They also argued that Chevron encouraged lawmakers to write vague or open-ended laws, knowing agencies would fill in the gaps. Over the next 40 years, Chevron deference was cited in thousands of court cases, influencing regulations across every sector of the American economy, from healthcare and finance to agriculture and manufacturing. Critics said this led to regulatory whiplash, as rules and interpretations could shift dramatically with each new presidential administration, leaving businesses and individuals struggling to keep up. The doctrine's opponents, from legal scholars and constitutional experts to business owners and judges, argued it forced the judiciary to abdicate its constitutional duty to interpret the law independently. Over time, growing dissatisfaction and debate set the stage for a direct and dramatic challenge to Chevron's dominance in American law. That challenge would come from an unlikely source, a small group of New England fishermen whose fight would ultimately bring Chevron deference back before the Supreme Court. The case that ultimately toppled the Chevron doctrine, a cornerstone of administrative law for decades, did not begin in the marble halls of Washington, D.C., but rather on the cold, choppy waters off New England, aboard humble fishing boats. Here, small-scale herring fishermen, including the owners of the vessel Relentless, found themselves facing a federal rule that required them to pay out of pocket for government monitors to ride along on their boats. For these fishermen, already operating on thin margins, the added cost was not just a burden, it threatened their very way of life and the survival of their family businesses. The law that authorized the use of observers was silent about who should bear the cost. Despite this, the federal agency in charge decided that the fishermen themselves would have to pay, interpreting the silence as permission to shift the financial burden onto them. Under the Chevron doctrine, courts were required to defer to the agency's interpretation of ambiguous or silent statutes, even if the result was controversial or burdensome. The fishermen, represented by the new Civil Liberties Alliance, argued that such sweeping regulatory power should not rest with unelected officials. They insisted that only Congress, not agencies, should make decisions with such profound economic consequences for citizens. Although lower courts sided with the government, applying Chevron deference, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. This set the stage for a direct and historic confrontation with the Chevron precedent itself. The fate of agency power and the future of how federal regulations are interpreted now rested on the story of these determined fishermen and the judgment of 9 justices. Their fight would not only decide their own livelihoods, but would also reshape the balance of power in American government for generations to come. The Supreme Court's ruling was clear and forceful. Interpreting the law is a judicial function, not an administrative one. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that Chevron forced courts to surrender their judgment to agencies, undermining the separation of powers. The court overturned Chevron, ending its 40-year reign and restoring the judiciary's role as the final arbiter of legal meaning. Justices from across the ideological spectrum wrote concurring opinions, emphasizing fairness for individuals and the need to protect constitutional principles. Justice Sotomayor highlighted how Chevron often tipped the scales against ordinary people facing government power. Justice Gorsuch celebrated the return to first principles. Judges must judge, and legislators must legislate. The message was unified. The era of judicial deference to agencies was over. From now on, courts, not bureaucrats, would decide what the law means. The court's decision immediately shifted the balance of power in Washington. Presidents can no longer rely on agencies to push policy through broad interpretations of vague laws. Congress now faces pressure to write clearer, more detailed legislation, as ambiguity will be resolved by judges, not agency heads. The judiciary reclaims its authority, with federal judges required to independently interpret statutes. This will likely lead to more litigation, as individuals and businesses challenge agency rules in court. Agency leaders will become administrators, not policymakers, with less incentive to stretch their authority. The federal government must now operate closer to the textbook model. Congress writes the laws, the executive enforces them, and the judiciary interprets them. It's a fundamental realignment of power not seen in generations. The economic impact of ending Chevron deference will be felt across every industry. Small businesses, long disadvantaged by shifting regulations, now have a stronger chance to challenge agency rules in court. Legal stability will make it easier for businesses to plan and invest, reducing the risk of sudden regulatory changes. Heavily regulated sectors like energy, healthcare, and finance will see a wave of legal challenges, but ultimately a more predictable framework. The ruling also limits the president's ability to use agencies for sweeping economic actions, like imposing tariffs, without clear congressional authority. In the short term, courts may face a backlog as old rules are challenged, and agencies may struggle to respond quickly to new problems. The long-term benefit, a more stable, accountable regulatory environment. The transition will be disruptive, but the promise is greater economic certainty. For ordinary Americans, the Supreme Court's decision changes the balance of power between citizens and the government. No longer will agencies automatically win in court when laws are unclear. Judges will now independently interpret the law. This gives individuals, from veterans seeking benefits to homeowners disputing regulations, a fairer shot at justice. Major social issues like education and civil rights will be decided by courts, not shifting agency policies. The ruling forces Congress to debate and decide important policies in public, rather than leaving them to agency discretion. While this may mean more political gridlock, it also means more transparency and accountability. The government becomes more responsive to the people, as elected representatives, not bureaucrats, hold the power to shape the law. For the average citizen, this is a shift toward a more democratic and accountable system. Legal scholars agree, this is the most significant administrative law ruling in a generation. Supporters, like Columbia's Philip Hamburger, call it a victory for constitutional governance, restoring the separation of powers and protecting liberty. The new Civil Liberties Alliance, which led the legal fight, says the goal was not to end regulation, but to ensure agencies stay within constitutional limits. Critics, like Harvard's Jody Freeman, warn that agencies may now struggle to address complex, fast-moving issues, like climate change or public health. Without Chevron, judges, not experts, will make key decisions, risking regulatory paralysis and inconsistent standards across the country. Some fear this will politicize the judiciary and create confusion until the Supreme Court resolves inevitable legal conflicts. While the decision reins in agency overreach, it also raises tough questions about how government can respond to modern challenges. The debate over the administrative state is far from over. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision has redrawn the map of American government. By ending Chevron deference, the court reasserted that judges interpret the law and lawmakers write it, restoring the separation of powers. The ruling curtails executive power, demands more from Congress, and promises greater stability for businesses and individuals. It also brings new challenges: short-term disruption, more responsibility for lawmakers, and a need for engaged citizens. This is not just an endpoint, but the start of a new era in constitutional law. The success of this new balance depends on how each branch and the public responds. With more power returning to Congress, our votes and voices matter more than ever. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed a government of laws, not of men. Now, it's up to us to ensure this new era delivers on its promise.